Hey, everybody, welcome to Your Money Map, sponsored by the Alliance for Lifetime Income. I'm your host, Jean Chatzky. Very glad to have all of you with me today. I was thinking as we were preparing for this show about the first book proposal I ever wrote. I say proposal because it never became an actual book. It was called In Between and In Control. And I was at the time in my 20s. I was in my maybe first or second job out of college. I was feeling kind of lost. Not still a student, not quite a grown up, not exactly comfortable in my skin. And this whole area of transitions seemed to me to be kind of ripe for research and understanding. Clearly, I was not the person to understand it. I had quite lived enough, I think, to really wrap my brain around such a big and important topic, because clearly, as my guest today will tell us, we spend a good portion of our life in transition, and navigating those transitions is it's really a skill. It's a skill that we should spend some time trying to master. My guest today is Bruce Feiler, and he is the author of 7 New York Times bestsellers, including the book Life in the Transitions, The Secret of Happy Families, and Council of Dads. His TED Talks, he's got 3 of them. They've been viewed more than 4 million times, and he teaches the TED course, How to Master Life Transitions. He's also got a brand new book. It's called The Search: Finding Meaningful Work in a Post-Career World. We're going to talk about all of those things today. So let me say welcome to Bruce Feiler. Thank you so much for being here.
My privilege. Thank you so much for inviting me. Longtime fan, first time caller, whatever the old line from talk radio. We're dating ourselves here at the outset, but what a beautiful way to frame this conversation, right? That you felt you felt even in your 20s that this space of being in between was a regular part of life, and yet one that we've not only understood, but I would say also under theorized, and also under helped people to navigate them when we do inevitably encounter them.
Yeah, and you have had, I mean, such a varied and exciting path through multiple, I don't know if you call them careers or stops along your journey. Tell everybody a little bit about you and what got you to the point where you embarked on the search.
Well, I appreciate that question. That's a very kind way to frame it. So, my story is I grew up in Savannah, Georgia, 5 generations of Southerners. I left there. I went to the Northeast to go to college and left there in the 80s. This was the age of discount airfare, and I started traveling. And I ended up in Japan teaching junior high school, and I started writing letters home on crinkly airmail paper, which the kids today have no idea what that's about. But when I got back to Georgia, everyone said, "I loved your letters." And I was like, "Great, have we met?" And it turned out that my grandmother had Xeroxed them, another dying art, and passed them around, and they went viral, right, in the original sense of that word. And I thought, well, if this is that interesting, I should write a book about it. And it doesn't happen this way, but I sold my first book 35 years ago off of a book proposal to your story. And I've never held a job since. But I think in the context of the conversation we're about to have, I think of my life in an odd way as kind of the fantasy linear life. Like in my 20s, I wrote books about Japan and England. I spent a year as a circus clown. In my 30s, I went back and forth to the Middle East, writing books and making television about religion and contemporary life. You can see me on a camel behind me in the shot that we have here. I got married and had children, right? That's in entrepreneurial terms, that's the hockey stick. But then in my 40s, my life just was completely, thrown into turmoil. First, I got cancer, as you know, at 43, and as the father of identical twin daughters. That's when I invited a group of friends to become a council of dads, to be supportive to my girls. I had financial troubles, to the theme of your expertise and the voice you've played in our culture for so long. And then my dad, who had Parkinson's at the time, got very depressed and tried to take his own life 6 times in 12 weeks. So, you know, back to the storytelling, like here I was, I'd spent all this time around the greatest stories ever told, and I couldn't even tell my own life story. And that was my, my work, if you will. But when I did, what I found is that everybody goes through times when they are upended or they feel like off track or off kilter or off schedule in some way. And I called my wife one night. I was actually at a college reunion and I was hearing all these stories. And I said, no one knows how to tell their life story anymore. And I want to do something to help. And that's what propelled me into what's now become 7 years of collecting and analyzing hundreds of life stories of Americans of all ages and all walks of life, all 50 states, looking for patterns that can help us all when we are precisely in that phase of in between that you described earlier.
When you put those stories together and when you look for threads, what do you find that we share and that can help us no matter what our personal transition looks like?
Yeah, well, that's such a beautiful way to frame the question, because there are a lot of commonalities. I find when people get into a transition, they do one of two things. Either they make a 212 item to-do list and say, like, I'm going to get through it in a weekend and be the best ever and get a blue ribbon and a gold star, or they sort of lie under they lie under the covers with a cat and they say, I'm never going to get through it and woe is me. But I think I think that if you look at enough of these times, then I do think certain patterns become clear. And I would say sort of the three things the three kind of big lessons I've learned, you teed some of it up in the beautiful intro, is number one, the idea of the linear life is dead. Okay. So all of us who are 50 plus, we grew up at a time when we were told that life follows a sort of linear progression. But this is an accident. I mean, if I can sort of just geek out on history for 30 seconds, like in the ancient world, they didn't have linear time. They thought life was a cycle. There were no clocks, right? It was actually the Bible in the West that introduces the idea of linearity. But even in the Middle Ages, they think life is a staircase up to middle age and then a staircase down, right? Straight up and then straight down. So a lot of what everybody, joining us today in this, the idea of no second love, right?
Right.
No retiring and moving to Florida and opening a B&B or an Airbnb or whatever it might be, straight up, straight down. That's almost exactly the opposite of how those of us who grew up in the 20th century were taught, because basically with the birth of science, the idea that life follows, sort of the way we look at the world affects how we look at our lives. So in the industrial age, where they have, right, assembly lines and conveyor belts, like that's where the linear idea comes from, right? So you've got Piaget, who says children go through development. Erickson, right. The 8 stages of moral development, the 5 stages of grief. These are all linear constructs. And this reaches its peak in the 70s when Gail Sheehy, a lot of our mothers wrote this book, Passages, which popularized the idea that everyone does the same thing in their 20s and their 30s, and then everyone has a midlife crisis between 39 and 44 and a half. That's bunk. And yet this became absolute standard procedure. But now we begin to understand that linear idea is dead because it's been replaced by what I call the nonlinear life. And that involves, as you say, many more life transitions.
For those of us who are in our 50s, right? I'm 59, almost 60. I was raised with those linear expectations. I worked for Gail Sheehy's husband.
Wow.
Yeah. So I mean, I was raised to believe that's how it is. And as people my age, maybe a little older, maybe a little younger, look to that next phase of life, look to retirement or whatever it is we're going to call it. Have you found that we have difficulty adjusting to the fact that it is more nonlinear these days, or are people just embracing it?
Well, there's a lot in that question, and I think that it's worth pausing. I mean, I would say that the line from my work okay, over 2 books. You mentioned Life is in the Transitions, which came out in 2020, and my book, The Search on Work, which came out this year, is the line in my work that is quoted back to me most often gets to exactly this frame, which is we have linear expectations, but nonlinear lives. And when people feel that something is wrong with them, that's the problem, because nothing is wrong with you. It's wrong with your expectations of what was going to happen. So those expectations, the idea of predictability and linearity, let's just take the idea of, the pandemic. If you were between 39 and 44 and a half, you were having a midlife crisis. But if you were between the ages of 58 and 64, you were also in a crisis. Or my children at the time were 14, they were also in a crisis. We have to accept that these periods happen whenever. I call it like the whenever life crisis, not the midlife crisis, okay? So let's just go back to the kind of the big frame here. So the number one lesson is that the linear life is dead. The number two lesson is that this nonlinear life involves many more life transitions. How many? So my data show that the average person goes through what I call a disruptor 36 times, 36 times in the course of their lives. That's once every 12 to 18 months. That's more often than many people see a dentist. Okay. Yeah. And it can be as small as like a fender bender or as big as losing a loved one. And most of these we get through relatively easily. But 1 in 10 of them becomes what I call a life quake, right? Which is a massive burst of change. Okay. And the signature piece of data from Life is in the Transitions is that the average length of a life quake is 5 years. So you think 3 to 5 times in a lifetime, 4, 5, 6 years, that's 25 years. That's half of your adult life that you're in transition. And the big problem that we've had, Gene, is that we have stigmatized this time, that's the aberration. But in fact, that's the norm. And if there's one thing I'm trying to do is to say these periods can be difficult, will be difficult, but they're also opportunities for growth and renewal if we flip the script and say it's not just a negative time, it's also a period when we can have, personal growth, reimagine what gives us meaning, and then make a new plan to move forward.
I do want to talk about what happens when these life quakes are financial. But before we get there, your work has found that in each transition, there are 3 stages, and you have to go through them. Maybe not in the right order or in the prescribed order or in an order, but you got to go through them all. So can you tell us about them and how people navigate the stages?
So lesson number 1, linear life is dead. Lesson number 2, the nonlinear life involves more transitions. Lesson number 3, transitions are a skill that we can and must master. And that gets to the heart of your question. So the first thing to understand is that they have a shape. Okay. And it's interesting because I often say when I didn't go looking for transitions. I went, how do people tell their story? And transitions are what kept coming up. And when I went through this and I wrote my book proposal, it was like, why hasn't there been a major book on this in 40 years? Like you were on it early, in the 90s. And you were absolutely right, because the last major book on this was written in 1978. Okay. So they involve 3 phases. And that is that there's a kind of structure to them. The 3 phases are the long goodbye, when you accept that it's an emotional experience, you use rituals, in some ways to mark it. The messy middle, where you shed certain habits and create certain habits. And the new beginning, where you unveil your new self. And you're exactly right. For 100 years, since a German anthropologist named Arnold van Gennep invented the idea of rites of passage in 1908, all theorists of this said you have to do them in order. That's totally wrong. So how do you know where to start? The answer is each of us has a transition superpower and a transition kryptonite, okay? Some of us are good at saying goodbye. We like to turn the page. We like making lists. We like, moving on with our lives and readjusting them, okay? But some of us are people pleasers. We like the old life. We may not be good at the long goodbye. Maybe we're good at the messy middle. And so that's the key. Wherever you are, whatever you're good at, start there. But to echo the point that you made, you can't skip it. Okay, those of us who are list makers and to-do list creators and, let's sell the house, let's move, let's, whatever it might be, what you're probably doing is you're probably ignoring the emotional dimensions of what you're going through, right? I have looked hundreds of people in the eye and said, what was the biggest emotion you struggled with in your time of change? I'll ask anybody listening to us, what is the biggest emotion that you're battling? Number one answer, fear.
Yeah, put it in the comments, everybody. If
Oh
you're
yeah,
if
put
you're
it in the
listening,
comments.
let us see what you've
You've
dealt
been
with.
in a life transition, Gene. So let's model this. So I'm going to ask you, what's the biggest emotion that you have been struggling with in your recent transition?
Well, so I mean, my most recent transition was a move. I moved from Carrie says fear. I moved from a place where I had lived for 30 years into a new-ish community. I don't know if it hasn't been fear for me because I moved so many times as a child. I am not afraid of meeting new people and I can talk to anybody. But for me, it's been sadness.
Yeah.
I miss my friends.
So number one answer, fear. How am I going to get through this? How am I going to make new friends? How am I going to pay bills? How am I going to live without this loved one I was with for all these years, right? Okay, so fear is the number one. Number two, sadness. I miss my old life. I miss having my legs before I lost them, in an accident, right? I missed having my health and mobility, which I don't have because I'm a different age now. And third, by the way, shame.
Mm.
I'm ashamed that I need help. I'm ashamed that I can't pay my bills. I'm ashamed that I don't have that status from my old job. And now I don't know what gives me identity. I'm ashamed when someone stops me in the supermarket and says, "How is your child?" And I know that my child has, an addiction, right? Or an anxiety disorder. And I'm ashamed I don't know how to handle it. So how we manifest this, and this is going to get into the conversation with money that we're going to get to, is we talk openly about it. We share those fears. We use rituals to expunge them or honor them, or you have a farewell party or a welcome party. You do these gestures in order to say to other people, but almost even more importantly to yourself, I'm going through a life transition. I mean, like 80% of it, and this is going to really apply when we talk about money, is learning to put a language. Like what people say about my work is like, whew, like, you've put language to something I'm feeling that I don't know. My wife likes to say that I have hard knowledge about soft things. And a lot of it is just you. I mean, just to flip it, I think we've discussed, I mean, my twin daughters just started college. Like, I'm an empty nester. They have been going through a big life transition every single day till I was blue in the face this summer when they would talk about their fears or sadnesses or shames or anxieties. It was, you're in a life transition, normalizing that as a regular part of human life, because the life quake puts us on our heels. It's the life transition that is the human reaction that allows us to have some agency, to take control over it, and to begin to respond to the life quake, which often scares us to death.
2024 is the year that the Alliance for Lifetime Income is calling Peak 65. It is the year that more baby boomers will turn 65 than any
Nice.
other, at a rate of about 12,000 a day, which is just astonishing. And a lot of those people will begin to change up their work. Maybe they will retire. Maybe they will be retired. A lot of people are about 2/3 of people actually are pushed into retirement because of a change in their company, or a change in their health, or a change in their industry. And this will bring on some significant financial changes. When you think about financial life quakes or financial transitions, how are they the same and how are they different?
Yeah, I love this question. And I think, first of all, it gets to, I won't say that I'm ashamed about this, but it gets to, I would say, point number one, it gets to the biggest change I've made in working on this project. So when I started, I believed it was going to be there would be a different toolkit for navigating getting cancer at 43, becoming a new parent. Like, my wife and I are parents of identical twin girls. It was a life quake. Like, it was joyful, but it changed everything about our lives, right? So voluntary, like 57% are voluntary, but 43%, 50%, 57% of life quakes are involuntary, but 43% are voluntary. Like, that's pretty close.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons I like the term life quake is that it's value neutral. In the case of, say, what we're talking about now, like, it doesn't matter if you voluntarily walked away or you've pushed away. So I thought there would be a different toolkit for relationships, health, money, beliefs, whatever. that turns out to be wrong, that the basic structure of them is similar to others. But you also asked what's similar and what's different about them. I would say a burden that we have around financial transitions of this kind is we do not bring with it the history of learning to talk about this effectively in the way we have with others. I think at this point it's very clear. We know you have to work on your tennis game, right? You know you have to work on your souffle recipe so that it doesn't crash, right? We've had 2 generations of you have to talk about your relationships. Mm-hmm. We do not have that around money. That money is still very hard, and sort of a very basic thing about talking about money, which is that kind of the way I think about it is every conversation about money is a conversation about values. Even a conversation that we're not having about money, because that says the value is it's really hard to talk about it. So I think that would be point number 1 of how it's different. The second is we need to understand, and this is sort of the whole theme of my book called The Search that was on the placard when we started this conversation. I have it here, so I'll hold it up, we also carry these linear expectations around work, and we haven't moved beyond the lie. Like this book is built around, I'll sort of mostly leave it off stage, but what I call 3 lies and a truth. Lie number 1, you have a career. That's a totally artificial construct of 100 years ago, which builds the expectation of a linear series of jobs, right? Each one bigger and more prominent, whatever, like it goes on a resume, which is only invented in the 1950s, or you have a path. That's another myth. No, the truth is, you can decide whatever you want for whatever set of reasons you want or are forced to, that you can change your story and that you can find work that gives you meaning. The hard part about a life transition or a work transition or a kind of retirement, we can talk about the problems with that word if you want. The real challenge is you have the opportunity at this moment in your life to write whatever story you want to write and to find whatever meaning you want to find. The problem is no one has given us these tools of how it is to decide what is it that gives you meaning at this moment in your life. Because we've all been chasing the linear career, which turns out to have been, a rat race of its own. And now we have much more freedom, but it comes with this burden.
Well, and as we chase it, or as we look for it, as we conduct our own searches, and what I love about your construct of 36 different life transitions is, many of us have very, very long lives. So whether we quote unquote retire from the job that we've been doing for a long time in our 60s or in our 70s, we're still going to have a lot of years to transition in and out of things. As we conduct these searches, how do we balance the meaning question with the how do I pay for it question?
So, well, first of all, let me just underscore what you just said in your question, because I think it's really important. A problem with the idea of retirement is the expectation that it, sort of sets up and has now essentially gotten locked into the culture, that this is a decision that you make only once. Right. And that at a certain age, I mean, even this idea of 65, right, as powerful as it is that the peak of the baby boom will be 65. And I love this construct. It still doesn't change the fact that you could be living for 7 more years, 17 more years, or 27 more years, and you don't know at the time. I mean, you and I sounds like we both were born in 1964. So you and I are exactly the same age, and we could be making these decisions multiple times.
Right.
That we've talked about 36, disruptors. The average person goes through 20 work quakes in the course of their lives, right? So that is a lot. So the fundamental skill is, what do you do when you're in the moment? Okay, so let's just then talk about meaning to try to answer your question. So if you go back, here's sort of a frame, how I look at it. If you go back 100 years ago, in the lifetimes of, parents of most of us in this conversation, or parents or grandparents, I should say, most of our sources of meaning were given to us. You had to live where your parents wanted you to live, do what your parents wanted you to do, believe what your parents wanted you to believe, love whom your parents wanted you to love. Okay? Now today, all of that's gone away. Okay? You can live where you want to live. You can move. 60% of people, by the way, we ran the numbers, move in the course of a life transition. Do what you want to do, love who you want to love, believe what you want to believe. That's a great opportunity. By the way, let's say particularly for women, right? Because women were told, if you get off the escalator because you want to have children, or right now dads who are doing it more, thank you very much, Council of Dads, right? That if you get off the escalator, you will never get back on the escalator of work. Nothing has squandered more human potential. I'm literally thinking like maybe not even war, because half of us what a ridiculous thing to tell people.
Right.
For some artificial idea like an escalator. Like there is no escalator. So that's a big problem. Okay, so how do we do this? The basic building blocks of identity are what I call the ABCs of meaning. Okay, the A is agency. That's what we do or make or create, essentially for many of us, our work. The B is belonging. That's our family, our friends, our colleagues, our co-religionists, the people we, on the pickleball team or that we march in rallies with. And the C is a cause, a calling, something higher than ourselves, okay? So each of us has all three of these in us. Like I'm an ABC, I'm a writer, I'm very agentic, I'm a very involved family member and super involved dad. Cause less important to me. My wife is a CAB. She started a nonprofit. She's very cause-oriented. She's a co-founder and CEO. She's very agentic. Outside of family, friends are not so important to her, right? So she's a CAB, I'm an ABC. What happens in a transition is that we rearrange these priorities. So maybe you've been working and you want to spend more time with your family. Or maybe you've been caring for children or aging relatives and you want to do something for yourself. Or maybe you've been giving back and you're burned out, and you want to do something else. Or maybe you've been focusing on money and you want to give back to the community. So the issue is understanding how we're adjusting our priorities will help us. And that gets to the question you asked about money. And briefly, what I'll say is, it's not that money is not valuable as a means of meaning in someone's life. The difference between today and the past is it's not the only metric. Okay. I wrote an excerpt from this book, appeared over 3 pages in the Wall Street Journal. And when I said in the Wall Street Journal that money is not the only metric, some people want to focus on family or give back or make their community better. Like I talked to a guy in the search who was running the top Chinese American tech ad company. He saw the Al Gore movie and now is a foot soldier in the fight against climate change and ran for community office in his town in California. So it's not the only metric. And maybe you're at a moment that you're paying off debt in your 20s, or in my case, have 2 kids going to college and money needs to be front and center. Or maybe you're at a moment in your life where you want to prioritize anything else. And that's the key. You can change over time depending on where you are in your own life story.
Well, and I think that the thing that you need to do as you're going from an ABC to a BAC or a CAB or whatever you decide you are, is to be very conscious about the financial point. Because if you've decided that you're going to earn less as a matter of choice, right? You're going to do something different that is going to pay you less but be more rewarding, or live someplace that is more expensive or less expensive. You've got to adjust. You've got to be very proactive about how you organize the rest of your life around it. Bruce and I had the opportunity to chat briefly before we did this webinar. And, one of the things that has just stuck with me over the past couple of weeks is, Norman Lear and Henry Kissinger and Sandra Day O'Connor and Rosalind Carter and Charlie Munger. We lost all of these 90 and 100 plus year old people. And if that's not going to scare you into the fact that you have to plan for your longevity in a really active way, I don't know what will.
I met Norman Lear when he was in his 80s, and I was a columnist at the New York Times, and I was writing about what the TV show Modern Family said about modern families, and I was invited to his office, and he was so charming and told the most amazing stories. And then he wouldn't let me leave until he locked me in a conference room. I've never told this story at all, no less publicly. He locked me in a conference room across from his office in Hollywood to read a script that he wrote about a group of people basically in an assisted living facility, and how they were, sort of imagine if, Archie Bunker and Maude ended up in the same assisted living facility. And he wouldn't let me. So even in his 80s, he was still being creative. And I think, by the way, this gets this exact question to, so by the way, what am I going to come out and say, by the way, send it back for a rewrite, Norman?
Yeah,
I mean, come on.
It was brilliant, right? It was brilliant.
It's like, I used to joke that the easiest job I ever had was when a friend's wife, we were across the country from her family, invited me to go to the to the fitting for her wedding dress. And I was like, this is the easiest job I've ever had, because all I had to say was, it's beautiful, because no one's going to go up to her on her wedding day and say, what fool did you take to your fitting who told you that this was a good wedding dress? Anyway, the point, but this gets to the third a lie about work, which I didn't mention, which is that you have a job. And the reason that that's a lie is that it normalizes the idea of that the main job is the only job. In fact, we have one of 5 jobs. We have a main job. And by the way, fewer than half of us even have a main job anymore. We have a care job, like caring for loved ones or relatives or neighbors. We have a side job, which we hear about a lot, right? Which is something you do for love or money on the side. But we also have a new term that I've coined called a hope job, right? Which is something that you do that you hope becomes something else, right? Like working on a screenplay or selling, pickles at the farmer's market. Okay, I talked to a cop in her 50s, and she worked as a cop for 4 days on Amtrak. On Mondays, she babysat her grandchild, and on Saturdays, she sold brownies, at a farmer's market. She called them pot brownies, which I thought was funny considering that she's a cop. But that, I think, captures closer to the reality of people in the 60 plus demographic, right? Which is, it's not just a job or not a job, it's multiple sources of work that we cobble together. Because what's non-negotiable in this frame of meaning is that you do things that give you meaning. So the question is, maybe 30% of your time you're doing something because you need to pay some bills, or you want to travel, right? Or be generous to your grandchildren, or help out their parents with what other expenses that they have, right? Or, you want to give back. So you can cobble together work. And in a lot of ways, therefore, people 50 plus, 60 plus are at the vanguard. Again, most transition areas, those of us 50 plus are behind. We look at our kids and say, wait, what do you mean you're buying a house and you're not married? Or like, what do you mean you're having a child and you've not made this commitment? Or what do you mean you're quitting one job and don't know what you're doing next? People 40 minus, the millennials and Gen Zers, are much more comfortable with the idea of nonlinearity. But in the work thing, I think that those of us 50, 60 plus have an advantage, is because now that we are, most of us no longer in our main expensive years, right, of supporting children and paying for college, et cetera, that we can have more flexibility. That's the vanguard of where work is going. And here's where the retirees, I think, are going to be leading the way, but only if you can get over the expectations that the only way to work is to do one thing from 8 to 5, 360 days a year.
So we have covered a tremendous amount of ground here today. Thank you so much for that. I'd love to leave everybody with your top 3 things, right? As our audience, we know late 40s, many of them in their 50s, a little younger maybe than you and me, or a little bit older. But as we're approaching this period of transition and this period of searching, what would you send them out with?
Number 1, get off the should train. We live so much of our lives based on what we think that we should do, what our parents told us we should do, okay, what our cultures, communities, religions, schoolwork told, that we get on the should train very early on in our lives, and get off the should train and get on the want train. It's extremely challenging. a common thing that people told me, especially women, is that it took them into their 40s and 50s to realize that they were living someone else's dream and they wanted to start living their own dream. So number one, I would say, get off the should train. Number two, I would say the three things that I say to anybody, the most powerful three words. Like, we're coming up on the holidays when we're taping this, we're airing it live, and I will be available, afterwards. We're going to all be encountering people who are going through difficult times. The three most important words that we can say to anybody that we know or love or care for that's going through difficult times is my number two lesson to you, which is, you're not alone. Okay. All of us are going through it. Someone is going through a work quake or a life quake right now. Someone you love, someone that you live with, is probably going with one. You're not alone. There is help. There is knowledge. In the work that I'm doing and the work that you're doing, there is help out there for how to get through these difficult times. We can have difficult conversations, and they're very important. And then the last thing is, I will say that these are incredible periods of opportunity as well as pain. The Italians have this wonderful phrase, which I love, called lupus in fabula. The fabula is the fabulous version of our life. It's the fairy tale. It's the life that we all imagine and that we calculate in our dreams when we're young, and that we hope and expect that we will live. The lupus is the wolf. The lupus is the wolf in the fairy tale. It's the ogre underneath the bridge. It's the witch in the clouds. It's the downsizing. It's the diagnosis. It's the tornado. It's the pandemic. And the phrase lupus in fabula, wolf in the fairy tale, means just when everything is going well, along comes a wolf, a disruptor, a life quake that will interrupt it. And our instinct is to banish the wolf. Make it go away. Pretend it's not happening. But if you banish the wolf, you banish the hero. Because it's the hero that gets through, around, over, or somehow past the wolf, goes through the woods to the other end. And if there's one thing I've learned, is that if you banish the wolf, you banish the hero, and we all want to be and need to be the hero of our own story. And there's a reason we tell fairy tales every night, and it's what I'll tell you in ending, is that they're what allow us to turn our nightmares into dreams. We can get through this if we do it together, if we share our fears and our sadnesses and our shame, we recruit allies, we can turn these periods from one of difficulty to one of growth and renewal.
Bruce Feiler, the new book is called The Search: Finding Meaningful Work in a Post-Career World. Thank you so much for this. Where can we go to find more about you?
Well, first of all, thank you for all you're doing and for enabling and giving people the tools for these conversations, and you've done for so long. We've all learned from you. It's my honor to be with you. I'm Bruce Feiler. It's Feiler. You can find me on all social. I have a website, brucefeiler.com. I'm on Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn and all these things. You can find my work. You can reach out to me directly. I write a weekly newsletter called The Nonlinear Life on Substack on all these themes. And I love nothing more than hearing people's stories and helping them improve their own. So let's keep in touch.
Well, I'm sure you're going to hear from a lot of people through this. And for more information on this conversation, you can always go to our website. It is protectedincome.org. And for this conversation specifically, protectedincome.org/Feiler. Thanks so much for watching. Have a happy holiday, everybody. We'll see you soon. Bye, Bruce. Thank you.